welcome. Today we're going to be discussing a piece I've recently finished titled Do You Believe in Magic? It's a Doctor Strange character completed in Procreate 5. As always, I'm starting with a rough sketch. Truth be known, you're seeing probably the 5th or 6th attempt I made at trying to do a caricature of Doctor Strange, and by default Benedict Cumberbatch. Here's the thing, he's a very caricaturable person. He's easy to find the kind of cartoon inside. He's got very distinguishable features like the high cheekbones and the longer face. But unless all those things add up in the perfect combination, the resemblance is going to be lost. So I did want to take a moment here and talk about how to find the resemblance, at least, to the amount of success that I found. Now, in studying caricature, one of the things I'll tell you is that making sure that you have something that's exaggerated but still holds a true anatomical form is essential. You can't just make up a skull that wouldn't exist even if it is exaggerated in certain areas. So one of the things I was struggling at, and I didn't realize until later, is that the two sides of his cheekbones did not line up properly. And every time I tried to draw previous versions, because those cheekbones did not align with each other, the form seemed off, the resemblance was lost, the caricature didn't work, even though it looked like some parts were in place. Once I kind of discovered that, I actually kind of mapped out the skull a little bit as I did the rendering there. And once I finally got down a caricature that I liked, and this includes both the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, which is really where a lot of the resemblance is caught, shape of the head coming in last, then moving on to the hands. Now, I want to admit freely here that I love drawing hands. Hands are fascinating subject matter to draw, but I struggle with it. And I think a lot of artists would say something similar as well. Hands can be very, very difficult to get natural looking when you're trying to draw them, especially when you have to draw two of them and you want to keep them consistent with each other. And that's something I was struggling with here. I got the first hand down on the second try, I believe, but this other hand I'm trying to put in is a little bit more complex, and it's a really large piece of the composition that I had in mind. Was I wanted two hands performing some sort of magic, and to give something of a hint as to what's come ahead here, the magic is meant to be something of a light source, so I definitely wanted those two hands in frame shedding light, so it was very obvious where that light source was coming from. I could have probably edited this part out where I struggled several times to do hands and failed and started over and failed again, and etc. The thing about this is I think this is a good thing to leave in. I think it shows a good example of times when artists struggle. And I'm by no means professional at this, but I do struggle with certain things and I succeed in other things. And hands I draw quite a bit. But the reality is that these things have a lot of different points of articulation. And those points of articulation line up at different places on each of those fingers. It's a difficult thing to get right and to get the right angle as well. The point, keep at it. Eventually, with some reference maybe, or a little bit of practice, or just, again, that stick-to-itiveness, you can get it. This is the final version of the hand that I end up with. And maybe the bad news here, the good news, I'm not sure which way to look at this, or maybe the irony, maybe is the best way to say this. By the time this piece is over, you'll barely be able to see the hands, and they're not really meant to be the focus points anyway. They're hidden behind magic and behind the luminosity of the light that I'm putting in there. But it was important to me that these hands be accurate, at least as accurate as I felt them to be, in order for me to be able to move into the next piece of this. And again, this is all about proportions. So even as I'm trying to sketch in the body, I can see right away that it's not quite right. The arms are too long, or the torso is too large for the neck and the head. Because this is a caricature, these things can be normal, so I started out kind of just drawing in loosely. But when it came time to put the final figure together, what I did was separate body parts in different layers so I can move them around and juxtapose them with each other and decide what I wanted the final layout to be. Then I could also size those individual elements to make sure that I got the proportions right. Once I was fine with those proportions, then I was able to kind of put in the rest of the elements that were easy to kind of figure out once I had the basics laid in. So once the head and the torso and the hands were in place, then it was easy business to add in the pinky that's missing on the one hand, the belt and everything lower in the waist, and of course the cape as well. Get rid of the figure for a second, lay in the background. One of the things that is essential to the Doctor Strange mythos is his sanctum sanctorum, and that's the window in the background there that makes that building so recognizable. So that's going to be in the background, and it'll also provide us an additional light source as well. Now, we're going to get into color in a little bit here, but before we do, line work. I want to start moving away from these big, bold, comic book type outlines, but considering the subject matter seemed really appropriate here, and I really also wanted to make this piece very detailed, and I'm more comfortable working with that detail if I have a very distinct outline in a fine ink type setting. Now, the detail is enormous here, and I won't lie and tell you this took several days to put together between the sketches, the final outline, and then the coloring as well. Everything from down to the wraps in the hands, to the beads wrapped around the arms, to the several different layers of belts and all the things and the janglies that are hanging off the belt, to the clips that hold the cape on, and even the pendulum, or the pendant that's hanging around his neck there. All these are very, very detailed elements that took a lot of time to render in both sketch, final ink, and then eventually in color as well. So that being said, I am going to take a moment here to do a selfless plug and state that, if you like what I'm doing here, I really hope you'll take a moment to subscribe and maybe even share with somebody else that might be interested in subscribing also. The subscriptions don't cost anything to you as the audience, but to those of us that create this content, it's the reason that it kind of drives us to kind of make these videos. I love doing this, but the subscriptions enable us to hopefully one day get monetized, and that's not anything that's happening right now, but it is certainly a goal. So subscriptions help, absolutely. And if you can, take the time to click that subscribe button, and of course share with somebody else who might be interested in subscribing, then it makes it a motivating factor to keep creating content like this. And hopefully, if you want to comment, I can also take some advice on things you'd like to see in the future. So with that shameless plug out of the way here, let me just go ahead and talk a little bit about color theory. I took some new attempts and new techniques at trying to address color in this piece, not only in how it was applied, but in the choices I made in the colors. Now, it probably goes without saying that Doctor Strange has some very distinct coloring to his costume, something that I'm not going to make any attempts to change. The Marvel Universe is pretty clear, especially from the movie standpoint, on what this costume looks like. And even though I've taken some artistic liberties with some of the details, the color scheme is going to stay the same. So he is going to have a black beard with the gray stripe kind of running over the temple and the ear area. He's going to have a red cape. His tunic or his blouse or whatever you want to call it is going to be blue. His belt's going to be brown, and etc. etc. He's also got a specific skin tone to him that's a Caucasian skin tone. So again, these things I'm going to kind of keep as is. It lends us back to the movie, to the caricature, etc. But I have some choice here when it comes to how I liked this particular piece, and that's where the color theory aspect of this comes in. The backgrounds are getting inked right now, but in a very just a minute or so, I'm going to start putting in the first shades of color, and that coloring is going to be related to the tone that I want for this piece. Now, I'm going to be playing some colors off of each other, and in order to make that a little bit easier for me, I start by kind of graying out the main figure in the foreground here, so that way I can separate it from the background later. Once I got that all grayed out, I go back to my background, bring in the window, use that as something of a silhouette, and then create a light source behind it, almost like daylight coming in from the outside. And the choice of color there is going to be mostly orange with some tints of yellow and a little bit of red in there as well. Now again, these colors were chosen on purpose. It does speak to something of a morning sky and set of tones, certainly. But a little bit later on, after I get these general colors in, like the blues and the reds of the cape and so on and so forth, and when I start addressing the lighting source here, I'm going to be putting in a very distinct light coming in from behind him, and that light's going to be a bright yellow and orange. But then I'm going to have to complement that. And complement is really the appropriate word here, because I'm going to choose a complementary color, in this case blue, to represent shadow. It also kind of makes sense here from the perspective that we're going to be using a warm color for light, and then a cool color, blue, for shadow. And just to kind of maybe confuse this a little bit more, we're also going to have some magic coming out of his hands that's going to be a light source as well. And in order to play off that a little bit, I also made that light source blue to complement the light source coming in from the from the window behind him. So there's a lot kind of going on there with color theory. It's going to just kind of be built up layer after layer after layer, and it's going to take some time to kind of get it to the point where I kind of feel like it's mostly rendered properly, and hopefully achieve some balance between all this as well. Right now, the only thing I'm doing, though, is I'm taking the time to really kind of meticulously make sure that I get all my lines right when it comes to the big block colors. So that blue went in pretty quickly, but in order to make sure that I got it around the edges just perfectly, I needed to go in there and zoom in and do some detail work. The same thing can be said for the cape, and then the next shade of color that I go into, which would be the flesh. And, you know, if you're curious, I'll let you know that anything that's kind of its own color for the most part is going to be on its own layer. So the blue blouse, tunic, whatever you want to call it, that's its layer by itself. And when I go in to do light and shadow on it later, that separation of it from the rest of it makes it a little bit easier to kind of layer in some of that shadow and make sure it doesn't cross over lines and overspray into areas I don't want it to be in. And that's kind of important to think of later. Drawing sometimes is a little bit of a chess game. You have to think sometimes like 5, 6, 7 moves ahead. And I know that later on when I'm doing shadow and light, I'm going to want to use an airbrush so I can get a nice fade off of it. The problem with airbrush is that if you don't have the ability to kind of mark off certain areas, you're going to overspray into a place you don't want it to be, and you'll have to go back in and erase later, and it can be time consuming and messy as well. So I'm kind of trying to plan ahead for that by creating the tunic on one layer, the cape on another layer. And when I got to the belt and what I basically just loosely call all the jewelry, I put all that together on one layer, but the skin is also on its own layer. Now it looks a little bit gaudy right now, but you may notice there's some really over-the-top red that I've placed on his cheeks and his nose and his ear, a little bit on his lip, chin, forehead. This, I got to tell you, is a really kind of an essential part, at least I found, to anything that renders human flesh. Even darker flesh needs this red tone in there, and I know it looks over the top right now and is gaudy, but over time you're going to find that it blends in. I am going to lower the opacity on it a little bit, but I am also going to be adding light and shadow to this flesh tone a little bit later, and it's going to help all that blend in and make it look like it's more natural as I build layers up over top of it. That's the other thing that might be an important thing to kind of mention if you're this sort of person that's just kind of experimenting with this for the first time. As far as that elaborate chess game of building this up step by step is concerned, sometimes it's not going to look like a finished piece right away. Sometimes you're looking at something and it looks really ugly, and it may be tempting to just give up on it, to move on to a new project or to start over or something like that. But this is an element of it. I call it kind of the growing pains phase of it. If you spend a little bit more time with it, if you take the time to kind of figure out where your mistakes are and work to fix them, and digital media like this gives you a lot of opportunity to fix without any permanent damage or anything like that done, well, you can back out anything and start over, and so if you keep at it and don't give up on it and have the confidence to kind of plow through and see it through to the end, you can end up with a finished product that, even though it may have started out as kind of the ugly duckling before, might be something that you're proud of a little bit later on, and it's something kind of important to think of. Honestly, this is actually, in my opinion, a pretty good looking piece right now. A friend of mine looked at this early on and said, "Oh, it's done." And I said, "No, no shading, no light has been added in yet, but it looks very comic bookish at this point with those big bold colors." I knew that light was going to be the next piece I was rendering, so before I did that, I went in and adjusted the darkness on each of those layers just to darken the color that I started off with for that flat tone. Then coming in and doing the light. Now again, I gotta tell you, I know this looks over the top, but I've done some experimentation with this, and the thing about it is that it blends. It will kind of fit in there and look natural once you balance it out with shadow on the other side. Also, please bear in mind here, I'm putting in some pretty bold light at this point, but I'm going to go in with an eraser with an airbrush attachment and fade off those harsh edges so it'll blend a little bit more in that aspect also. I do love putting in shadow quite a bit, so I couldn't resist and didn't finish the light right away and went in and started putting in the shadow on the cape. Again, this is an airbrush tool, so I don't really have a lot to say about it, other than just making sure that I'm following the folds in the cape and figuring out the appropriate places to put those shadows. And for the most part, I think that's easy to kind of figure out if you have a little bit of experience in working with this. However, I think it's important to point out maybe two things here. Number one, I'm using a select tool to make sure that I don't overspray edges that I don't want to overspray. Number two, I'm also using a clipping mask. So I'm using the clipping mask to make sure that I had the cape select and the cape only. So I didn't have to worry about overspraying into the tunic or anything like that. But again, it's also helpful to use the select tool to make sure that you're staying within the lines as well. One last thing to kind of mention here in terms of these shadows is that I do like the way they fall on the cape, but an essential element is to understand that there needs to be some balance to this. This is going to be one very, very dark piece at the end of it, and it shouldn't be with all the light involved, unless I add more light sources to it. So I think it looks kind of cool right now, maybe even a little bit gothic, but it is missing light, and because it's missing light, it's not really balanced yet. That will come later. In a previous piece, I also mentioned the idea of the blob that you see in the window behind Doctor Strange right now. It's a gray blob. It doesn't seem to serve much purpose. It'll kind of stay there for the majority of the piece and then occasionally just kind of flip on and off. I know I get questions about it occasionally, so I thought I'd just bring it up really quick and address what this is for. This is a layer that sits by itself with no special setting on it. No special blend mode, it hasn't been set to multiply or anything like that, it's just set to a normal layer. Now the reason for this is because this is the palette for my shadows. In other words, this is a specific color that I was using to render this shadow on a multiply layer. So when I go in and I put in those airbrush shadows, I use a layer set to multiply, so it drags up colors underneath it, like the red of the cape finds its way into the shadow and makes a more natural looking tone. Now the thing about it is that you notice the blob is gray, and it is meant to be gray. It's actually a blue gray because my shadows are cool blues. But when you put it on a multiply layer and it brings that red up from underneath of it, you get a good shadow tone out of it. However, going back and finding it later if I change colors can be very challenging. So I leave the natural form of it on its own layer in a normal mode, so that way I can go back and reselect it anytime I need it, so I can get that consistent tone, or that consistent hue maybe, for all my shadows on the cape, and for some other elements around the piece as well. It's just a little trick that I kind of saw somebody else do, and I kind of adopted it for my own. It's really just a nice kind of place to put down a color and say, okay, what if I want to come back to it later? Here's where it is. Sometimes I'll do this with just the shadow and nothing else, because there are other ways to select colors that you've used before. But this, again, I find to be a quick way to get my shadow tone, which can change from time to time depending on what part of the picture I'm rendering. One of the last things we're going to be seeing here is the rendering of the last light source, which is the magic coming out of Doctor Strange's hands. This was an experiment, to put it loosely. I wasn't sure if it was going to work. I took a stab at what I thought might be effective, and I don't know that I was 100% successful. I think I might try some other things in the future for like glow effects and things like that, but for the most part I think I pulled it off. I'm not going to speak a lot to how I did it. If you have questions about that, feel free to leave them in the comments and I can do a tutorial on it later. But I will say that this was a labor of love. It took a long time to render all the light in this. It took a lot of time to render all the detail and the magic spells that surround his hands, and to kind of experiment with things that worked and didn't work, like the drawings of the hands and things like that. At the end of the day, this is a very long piece, and hence the video is probably one of the longest ones I've ever produced. And it took me a little while to put this together too, to make sure that it was the quality that I wanted, to kind of speak to all the detail that went in to this, again, labor of love. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to sign off here, let you enjoy some of the music, and appreciate the rest of the art. And one last time, I'll just ask you, if you do like what I'm doing here, please take a moment and subscribe, and have a great day. Thank you.